I don't know if you spend much time analysing movie plot lines. You know, the structure of what the story looks like. Probably not, it's probably just me, but the next few moments I'm going to share some of them with you. First one I want to talk about is your typical rom com, and it usually goes something like this: boy meets girl, there's some sort of chemistry and they hit it off, only for some terrible complication to occur. Only in the end for everything to work out, usually with one of them desperately running through the streets. Does that sound familiar? I suspect it might. Well, try this one out for size. Your typical heist movie. Some sort of suave ringleader formulates a plan for the job. He or she assembles a crack team. They all learn the job and they begin to execute the plan only for something to go inexplicably wrong. They have to improvise, usually pulling off the job with seconds to spare. And then often at the end you find out that it's all part of the ringleader's plan from the beginning. I could go on, but you'd probably be pleased that I won't. But I'd be surprised if these plot lines don't sound a little familiar to you. I mean, they fit quite a lot of films. I mean, if it's not broke, why fix it? These are the kind of stories that we like, aren't they? I don't know if you noticed, but they often have one thing in common. At some point in the film, there's a point where everything goes spectacularly wrong. Maybe the lovebirds have a fight. Maybe the casino has installed a new high-tech security system. Whatever it is, something goes awry. I mean, most stories have this. It's what gives them their edge, makes that happy ending even more satisfying. A couple of years ago, the highest grossing film of all time was released. It's called Avengers Endgame. And I went to see it on opening night. Well, actually, it was opening morning because I went to a midnight showing of it. Now, actually, this film was the second part of a two-film sequence. The first one was called Avengers Infinity War. That was part one. It was released about a year before. And this was the conclusion that I stayed up late to watch one night. Now, this was a classic case of how things can go wrong in films because Avengers Infinity War Part 1 ended, well, it was a bit of a downer as half the life in the universe vanished into thin air. Doesn't get much worse than that, does it really? Not great at all. It was quite a somber note to end the film on, except that we knew that Part 2 was about to come. And as I sat in the cinema that night, surrounded by literally hundreds of other people packed in there, you wouldn't get it these days, we knew that although it had all gone wrong, that was okay, because there was something more to come. There was going to be some sort of resolution before the end of the film, because we knew that's how these films work. We suspected everything was going to turn out well in the end. That's what Part 2 was all about. And the familiarity of these kind of stories, the fact that we knew it was all going to turn out right, we have this kind of remembrance and knowledge that this is how these stories work out. This is why our Bible reading today is so strange, why it pulls us up short, or we might read it and scratch our heads and wonder what on earth is going on. Let me explain. You see, today's reading is part 2. Part 2 of the story. We had part 1 last week. Remember, it's when Simon Peter said that Jesus was the Messiah. And Jesus said he was going to build his church on Peter's shoulders. And it was this great, big, amazing climax. It was a great part of the Gospels, one of the high points in the Gospels. If it was in a cinema, people will be standing up and cheering. Well, maybe not in this country, but maybe in America, that's the kind of thing that they would be doing at this point in the film. And today we come to part 2, the sequel. What happens next, if you like? And what happens next is this. It all goes south. The bottom falls out. It all goes spectacularly wrong. Everything. Because here's Peter on cloud 9, and 5 minutes later, Jesus is saying, "Get behind me, Satan." What on earth has gone wrong? What happened? Well, Jesus has begun to explain to his disciples that the Son of Man, and that's him, by the way, is going to have to suffer and will die at the hands of the leaders and the chief priests in Jerusalem. Obviously, that's bad news, but there's a reason why it enrages Peter to such an extent. See, the people at the time, they knew the story of the Messiah pretty well. When he came, they knew what was going to happen. Just like you and I recognise the plots of those rom-coms and heist movies, there were not going to be any surprises. When the Messiah came, he was going to go from success to success. He would save his people, he would drive out his enemies before him. Eventually, he would be enthroned as king, just like his ancestor David was. God's reign of peace and prosperity would begin. That's the way the story was supposed to go. And did you notice there was no suffering and death involved? In fact, if some would-be Messiah came to a sticky end, then that was a pretty good sign. Actually, it was conclusive evidence that they were not the Messiah in the first place. The Messiah is not defeated by his or her enemies. End of story. So think about it from Peter's perspective. He's just taken this massive step, putting into words the things that's been in everyone's mouths. For the first time, he's said it out loud. Jesus has clapped him on the back and congratulated him. And now he suddenly hears Jesus saying the kind of things that, if they're true, mean that Jesus isn't the Messiah. No wonder Peter is nonplussed. No wonder he just wants to shush up Jesus, like trying to shush an embarrassing relative. No wonder Peter explodes and says, "Shut up, Jesus! You can't talk like that. Don't talk like that." No wonder Jesus wants none of it. After all, it's hard enough to steel yourself on the road that leads to suffering and death without your best friends trying to hold you back. And this is the rub of it, really. Part 2 is a hard story to tell. It's a hard story to accept. It's not the story anyone expected. They didn't think it was going to work out like this. And this is why it all comes off the rails. Because it isn't supposed to be like this. Great climaxes, standing ovation moments, peaks in your life. They're not supposed to be followed by rocky paths and hardship and suffering. It's supposed to be the other way around, isn't it? Hardship is supposed to be something that we have to get through before we eventually make it. The Messiah isn't supposed to suffer. He's not supposed to die. And yet, here we are. What I'm trying to say is that often our expectations of how life should be, what God is supposed to do in our lives, are based more on the plot line of movies, what we think should happen, than they are on what real life is like. It's really easy for us to expect our lives to fit into those neat patterns. When it doesn't, we can get upset, we get angry, we get confused. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe God is the one to blame. Or maybe it was just meant nothing in the end. But now, more than ever, I reckon, in the midst of this global pandemic, I think perhaps we're learning as people that life doesn't follow these neat patterns. The answers don't come quickly or easily. That hardship doesn't always lead to triumph at the end. That's just not how life works. And what our reading shows us today is that we shouldn't be surprised by that, because that's not how God works either. In the real world, the Messiah has to suffer and has to die. And often it doesn't seem like there's much more after that. In the real world, life can be hard and unpleasant, and often there is simply no reason for it, and sometimes there is little relief from it. In the real world, there is injustice. And often it seems like the poor and the forgotten people are, well, they're forgotten. But our God is not the God of the movies. Our God is the God of the real world, in all its messiness, in all its brokenness. While he might not be in the business of quick and easy answers, while God might not be about quick fixes, he is in the business of hope. Hope. That is why Jesus is called and why Jesus is sent and why Jesus gives of himself for the good of others. Why Jesus goes on that road to suffering and to death. Herbs are just like Jesus, women and men and children. In our time and in history, in centuries gone by, can be equipped and empowered by God every single day to go out and do good, to make the world better, to make it more right. Our God is in the business of herb that we too can be similarly empowered, not with superhuman strength or magic powers like we see on TV or at the cinema, but that we can be empowered by the very life of God, so that we might stand on behalf of others, that we might stand on their behalf, I stand up for them, we might do good for those who are in need, that we might stand firm when life is tough. Our God is in the business of herb, because actually the story doesn't end here. Actually, part 2, well, it's more like the middle part, because there is a better day to come. This is what Jesus says too in our reading. He says the Messiah goes to suffer and to die, but yet 3 days later will rise again. So it's really easy to hear this as the promise of our happy ending, just tacked on at the end to make us feel better. And by the way, this isn't how people expected the Messiah to end up either. This isn't the story anybody expected, but it is God's story. And this last part of the story proves that everything that went before, all the good that was done, wasn't in vain. That Jesus is raised after 3 days proves that his suffering and his death was actually for good. That was the task and was the role of the Messiah. That was what actually the Messiah was called to do. That was how he was going to save others. And this resurrection herb is the herb that actually the good that we do, the good that we're called to do by God, isn't in vain. That we can make a difference, even though it seems like we're going through a massive slog. Like there'll never be any end of it, and maybe there won't be in our time, but there will be one day. This is God's hope. That in the end, the good that we see in the world, that is what stands the test of time. That's the thing that will actually matter. In the end, the good that we do, that others do in the world, that's the plot line. That's the heart of the plot that runs through life. That's what makes the story of life make sense. That's what God does. He makes our life, he makes the world make sense. Through herb, through Jesus, and through the good that he equips and empowers us to do as well. Amen.